We've officially made it halfway through 2026, and honestly, it's been a pretty great year for cozy games. Over the last 6 months, I've played everything from farming sims and management games to story driven adventures, and even a few games that stressed me out way more than I expected. And honestly, there are a couple placements on this list that I'm pretty sure some of you are going to disagree with. So today, I wanted to go back and rank every game that I've played so far this year. Now, before we jump in, here's how I'm doing my rankings. S tier, these are the games that defined my year. A tier are excellent games that I would easily recommend to people. B tier were good games that I enjoyed and would still recommend. C tier are games that had some issues or were only for very specific players. D tier were games that I would not recommend right now. And while making this list, I realized something about my taste in cozy games. My favorite cozy games are the ones that give me something to look towards too. I love setting into a routine, slowly building something over time, and just having mechanics that feel like they actually matter. If a game has me saying one more thing before logging off and then suddenly 3 hours accidentally disappear, it's probably going to rank pretty highly for me. So with that out of the way, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Starting in the D tier, these are the games that I personally have had a hard time recommending right now. Astro Botanica, this is a survival farming game set on an alien planet where you grow plants and manage resources to survive. And honestly, I really wanted to like this one because of the concept was super interesting. What really stood out to me was the alien ecosystem. Instead of constantly worrying about oxygen, you actually have to keep an eye on your CO2 levels to survive, which was a really unique twist that I hadn't seen before. The problem is that the tutorial and onboarding just didn't do enough to help me understand all of its systems. I spent a lot of time feeling confused about what I should be doing next, and because of that, I never got fully invested into the game. So while I think there's some really cool ideas here, right now it's going to be landing in the D tier for me. Next up is Bitter Harvest. This one grabbed my attention immediately because it was basically a farming sim with a much darker twist than most cozy games. Instead of inheriting a farm and becoming the town's newest farmer, you arrive in town only to find out that someone else has already taken the farm you were promised, leaving you stuck working as the town's garbage collector. What stood out to me most was the premises. The story deals with things like resentment, gossip, manipulation, and social status, which made it feel really different from the typical cozy farming game. Unfortunately though, the gameplay never lived up to the concept for me. After a while, most days started blending together in the same routine. Because of that, I found myself more excited about the game's potential than the actual experience itself, which is why it's also landing in the D tier. Moving on to C tier, these are the games that I think have an audience, but they either have some major issues or just didn't quite click with me the way the higher ranked games did. Nom Nom Cozy Forest Cafe. This is a rhythm-based cafe game where you serve adorable animal customers, customize food, decorate your cafe, and unlock new furniture as you play. What stood out to me most was definitely the decorating. I loved unlocking new furniture through their loyalty system and slowly building up the cafe over time. The art style is super cute, and it's one of those games that's just really easy to relax with. The thing that held it back for me was the rhythm gameplay. It starts off fun, but after a while it becomes a little repetitive. I found myself enjoying the decorating side of the game more than actually serving the customers. Now, if you're someone who loves decorating and creating cozy spaces, you might get a lot more out of this than I did, but personally, I just never got fully hooked onto the gameplay loop, which is why it is landing in the C tier for me. Then there is Tailside Cozy Cafe Sim. This is a cozy cafe management game where you run a cat cafe, decorate your space, serve customers, and slowly build up your business. What stood out to me most was the atmosphere. The game absolutely nails the cozy cat cafe kind of vibe, and I loved being able to customize and decorate the space to make it feel like my own. The problem is, after a while, the gameplay loop started to feel a little repetitive. A lot of the tasks felt more like chores than meaningful progression, and I found myself wishing there was a bit more depth to keep me invested long term. Now, I don't think it's a bad game by any means. If you're someone who mainly wants a cute decorating game with cats, you'll probably enjoy it, but for me, it never really quite reached that just one more day feeling that my favorite management games had, which is why it is going to be landing in the C tier. Blue Murder by Death. This one is a mystery game where you investigate a murder, gather clues, question suspects, and try to piece together what actually happened. What stood out to me most was the whole concept here. I'm a huge fan of mystery games, so the idea of solving a murder and slowly uncovering the truth immediately had my attention here. Unfortunately though, the investigation could be pretty frustrating. There were times where I wasn't sure where I needed to go next, and just tracking down clues often felt more confusing than rewarding. Instead of feeling like a clever clever detective, I sometimes felt like I was wandering around hoping to stumble into the next piece of information. I still think mystery fans might find something to enjoy here, but the navigation and progression issues held it back for me, which is why it's going to be landing in the C tier. Now, Fortune Seller, this was a roguelite card game where you're running a fortune-telling shop while making decisions that can dramatically change each run. What stood out to me most was how unique the concept felt. There aren't many games that mix fortune-telling, shop management, and roguelike mechanics together, so it definitely stood out from everything else that I played this year. The problem is, though, that the gameplay loop just never fully clicked for me. I could appreciate what the game was trying to do, but I never found myself getting excited to jump back in for another run. A lot of that, though, comes down to just a personal preference because roguelites just usually aren't my go-to genre. And because of that, this one is one of those games where I can see the appeal, but it just wasn't it for me, which is why it's going to be in my C tier. Now, Hotel Galactic, this was a management sim where you're building and running a hotel in a beautiful Studio Ghibli inspired world. And honestly, this one hurt a little because I really wanted to love it. What stood out immediately was the art style here. The entire game is pretty, and every time I loaded in, I just found myself stopping and looking around and just enjoying the character designs. The issue is that it feels very early. I ran into a few bugs and some systems felt a little unfinished, and there were moments where I could see the potential more than I could actually experience it. I think this is a game I'll absolutely revisit in the future once it fully releases because there's a lot here that I did like, but right now I still think it needs some time to grow before I can confidently rank it any higher, which is why it's landing in the C tier. Now, moving on to B tier, these are the games that I genuinely enjoyed and would still recommend. There were just a few things holding them back from reaching the top of my list. Now, Halcyon Days, this is a farming and life sim set in a world inspired by Taiwanese culture, and honestly, it had way more depth than I expected. The thing that surprised me most was just how much there was to do. Between the farming, fishing, crafting, relationships, and exploring the town, it felt like there was always something pulling me in another direction. The thing that held it back was that it could be a little bit overwhelming at times. The game throws a lot at you early on, and there were moments where I wasn't entirely sure what I should be focusing on. Even so, I had a really good time with it, and if you're looking for a farming sim with a lot of depth, this one is definitely one I'd recommend, so that is why it is going in my B tier. Now, Hermit and Pig was one of the weirdest games that I played this year, and I mean that in the best possible way. You play as a socially ancient hermit and a pig companion going on adventures and helping people throughout the world. Where this game really shines is its charm. The writing, the characters, and the humor gave this game so much personality, and it just constantly surprised me with how creative it was. The only thing keeping it from ranking higher is that while I really enjoyed my time with it, it never fully hooked me in the way that some of the games above did. Still, if you're looking for something unique and full of heart, I'd absolutely recommend giving it a shot. Now, Blossom, the Seed of Life, this is a cozy adventure game where you explore, solve puzzles, and help bring life back to the world around you. The atmosphere is what kept pulling me back into this one. The world felt peaceful, and there was something really satisfying about slowly restoring areas and seeing the environment change because of your actions. The thing that held it back for me was the gameplay never evolved enough to keep me completely hooked. I enjoyed my time with it, but I never reached that point where I constantly thinking about it when I wasn't playing. I still think it is a solid game, and that's why it's landing in my B tier. Now, Piece by Piece, this was a cozy puzzle game centered around restoring items and uncovering little stories along the way. The thing I ended up loving most was just how relaxing it was. There was something really satisfying about slowly putting everything back together, and I found myself getting surprisingly attached to some of the stories behind the objects. The biggest thing holding it back was that it felt a little short. By the time I was fully invested, it felt like the game was already wrapping up. I still had a great time with it though, and that's why it's landing in my B tier. Little Chef Cozy Cooking is next. This was a cozy cooking game focused on preparing meals. The biggest surprise for me was how approachable it felt. The cooking mechanics were so easy to pick up that it was kind of a game I would just sit down with it and immediately relax. The thing holding it back is that it feels like a game with a lot of potential rather than a game that's fully there yet. I enjoyed what I played, but I found myself wanting more depth and more systems to sink my teeth into. Because of that, it's landing in my B tier. Now, Hosey was a decorating focused cozy game where the goal is really just creating beautiful spaces and making them feel like home. Where Hosey really shines is its creative freedom it gives you. If you're someone who loves decorating and expressing creativity, there's a lot here to enjoy. The reason it didn't rank higher for me is because decorating games have never been my favorite part of cozy games. I tend to prefer progression systems or management mechanics and and just long-term goals. Even though I wasn't the perfect audience for it, I can still appreciate what it does and I did have a good time in it, and that is why it's going to be in my B tier. Huloniku Bowl Up. This was a fast-paced cooking game where you're preparing meals, managing orders, and trying to keep up with an increasingly chaotic kitchen. The thing I enjoyed most was finally getting into the rhythm and seeing everything click together, and somehow managing to keep everything under control, and these moments felt great. The thing holding it back is that it can get pretty stressful. There were definitely times where it felt more hectic than cozy, which isn't always what I'm looking for. I still had a lot of fun with it, and that is why it's landing in my B tier. Moomin Troll Winter's Warmth. This was a story-driven adventure set in the Moomin universe, focused on exploration, helping characters, and experiencing a quiet winter journey. Where this game really shines is the atmosphere. The game absolutely nails that cozy winter feeling, and there were moments where I just wanted to slow down and take everything in. The thing holding it back was the amount of backtracking and fetch quest. There were definitely times where I felt a little lost, and while it never became frustrating, it did start to wear on me after a while. I still think it's a lovely game for the right player, and that's why it's landing in my B tier. Now, Inkombini was a narrative-driven game where you spend time working in a small convenience store while learning more about the people around you. The storytelling is what made this game stick with me. The characters felt believable, and the conversations just felt natural, and it did a great job in making me care about the people that I was interacting with in the shop. The thing holding it back for me though, I wanted a little more from the gameplay side. I enjoyed the story, but once it was over, there wasn't much reason for me to keep coming back and playing again. Even so, it left an impression on me, and that's why it's landing in my B tier. Now, Outbound is a cozy survival game where you're living out of a camper van, exploring the world, gathering resources, and slowly building your dream mobile home. The concept alone was enough to get me interested. The idea of customizing a van, generating your own power, and creating a cozy home on wheels was such a cool idea. The thing holding it back is that I found myself more excited about the potential than the actual gameplay. There were moments where I wished some of the systems had a little bit more depth or progression behind them. That said, it's still a really unique game, and that's why it's landing in my B tier. The Abyss Garden. This was a historical gardening game where you're managing a garden while uncovering stories and learning about the people around you. What I appreciated most about this game was how different it felt from everything else I played this year. The setting, the writing, the slower pace, it helps stand out in a crowded genre. The thing holding it back is that it leans heavily into reading and narrative. While I appreciate what it was doing, there were definitely moments where I just wanted to spend less time reading and more time interacting with the game itself. I still think it's a really interesting game for the right audience, and that's why it's going to be landing in my B tier. Now, honestly, from this point on, the rankings got really difficult for me. These are all games that I genuinely loved, and on a different day, some of them could easily be moved around. The only reason they didn't make it into my S tier is because there was just one thing holding them back from becoming defining games for my year. Filna Fantasy. This is a pixel art action RPG where you explore dungeons, craft gear, level up skills, and slowly build your character into a hero. What stood out to me most was how much depth there was. Every time I thought I had seen everything, the game ended up introducing a new system, so whether it was alchemy, pets, crafting, or life skills. I also loved how rewarding the progression felt. There was always another piece of gear to craft, another skill to level, or another dungeon to explore. The thing keeping it out of the S tier was the onboarding. The tutorial felt incredibly long, and some of the later quests felt a little padded. But despite those issues, I sat down planning to try it for a couple hours and somehow lost an entire weekend to it. That's usually a pretty good sign, and that's why it is in the A tier for me. Now, Tiny Isle. This was a city building game where you're creating little islands, attracting residents, and expanding your tiny world. What stood out to me most was how satisfying the progression felt. Unlocking new residents and watching the island slowly come to life kept giving me reasons to keep playing. It's one of those games where you sit down intended to play for 20 minutes and suddenly you realize that 2 hours have passed. The thing holding it back was that things could get a little clustered as your island grew, and sometimes I wished managing everything felt a little bit smoother. Even so, I had an amazing time with it, and that's why it's in my A tier. Now, Karen. This was a mountain climbing survival game that ended up being one of the biggest surprises of the year for me. What stood out to me most was how tense and rewarding the climbing felt. Every decision mattered, and reaching the top of a difficult section genuinely felt like an accomplishment. I also loved how immersive the game was. It constantly had me thinking ahead and planning my next move. The thing keeping it from the S tier is simply that it's not a game I see myself returning to over and over again the way that I do with some of my favorite management and progression based games. Still, it completely exceeded my expectations, and that's why it's landing in A tier. Now, Fishbowl, this one is a narrative driven game focused on daily life, personal growth, and uncovering a deeply emotional story. What stood out to me most was how personal it felt. The story really stuck with me, and it's one of the few games this year that genuinely made me stop and reflect on what I just played. This isn't the kind of game that I would play every week, but I was in the right mood for it and it absolutely helped. The thing keeping it from the S tier is the longevity. Once you've experienced the story, there isn't a huge reason to keep coming back to it. This is one of those games that stayed in my head long after I finished it, and I think that's why it's landing in my A tier. Now, Pokemon Pokopia. This is a life sim where you build up your town, customize your space, and slowly work towards bigger and bigger projects. What stood out to me most was how easy it was to just keep coming back to. There's always another goal waiting for me, whether it was expanding, decorating, or working towards finding new Pokemon. The progression loop felt incredibly satisfying, and I found myself returning to it again and again throughout the year. The biggest thing keeping it out of the S tier is the price. I think it is a great game, but it's also one where I think some players may want to wait for a sale depending on how much content they're actually looking for. I kept finding excuses to come back to this one, and honestly that's usually a pretty good sign for me. That's why it's landing in my A tier. Under the Island, this is an action-adventure RPG inspired by the classic Zelda games where you explore dungeons, solve puzzles, and uncover secrets hidden beneath the island. What stood out to me most was just how polished everything felt. The combat was fun, the world was enjoyable to explore, and there was always something new waiting around the corner. I also appreciated that it wasn't afraid to challenge me. A lot of cozy adjacent games play things really safe, but this one trusted the player to learn its systems and improve. The thing keeping it from the S tier is that while I really enjoyed it, it never completely consumed my life the way that some of the higher games on this list did. I found myself constantly wanting to see what was around the next corner, and that's usually a sign a game is doing something right, and that's why it's landing in my A tier. Now, cleaning up. This is exactly what it sounds like, a game all about cleaning up messy spaces and slowly restoring them back to normal. But somehow, I got way more addicted to this than I expected. What stood out to me most was how satisfying the gameplay loop felt. There's just something incredibly rewarding about taking a chaotic room and slowly making it spotless. The reason it isn't higher is because it doesn't have a ton of longevity. Once you finish cleaning everything, you've kind of seen what the game has to offer. I genuinely didn't expect a cleaning game to hook me this hard, but somehow it did, and that's why it's landing in my A tier. Now, Vending Machine Co. This is a management sim where you build and expand your own vending machine business. If you've watched my channel for any amount of time, you probably already know that this is exactly the kind of game that gets me hooked. What stood out to me most was the progression. Every upgrade felt meaningful, every expansion gave me something new to work towards, and I constantly found myself saying, okay, just one more thing. The only thing that keeps it from being an S tier game is that compared to some of the games above it, it felt a little smaller in scope. Even so, this game absolutely scratched the management sim edge, and that's why it's landing in my A tier. Now, Duck Side of the Moon. This was a charming little adventure game where you play as a duck exploring the moon and helping characters you meet along the way. Honestly, this was one of the biggest surprises of the year for me. What stood out to me most was just how much personality it had. The writing was funny, the quests were enjoyable, and the whole game had this weird charm to it that made it hard not to smile while playing. The thing keeping it from the S tier is simply that I just wanted more. By the time I was really invested, the game was already coming to an end. That doesn't take away from how much I enjoyed it though, and that's why it's landing in an A tier. Now, Froggy Hates Snow. This was a roguelike where you play as a frog trying to survive increasingly difficult runs while unlocking upgrades and becoming stronger over time. And this game completely caught me off guard. What stood out to me most was how addictive the progression felt. Every run was teaching me something, unlocking something, or getting me one step closer to my next goal. I kept telling myself I'd do one more run, and then suddenly an hour had accidentally disappeared. I think the thing that's keeping it from the S tier is that roguelikes aren't my usual go-to genre, and I don't see myself revisiting it as often as some of my other favorite management games. But it definitely ended up being one of the biggest surprises of the year, and that's why it's landing in the A tier. And finally, we made it to S tier. These are the games that completely defined my first half of 2026. The games that I couldn't stop thinking about, couldn't stop playing, and somehow always found myself coming back to. When I look back at everything that I played this year, these are the games that stood out the most. Now, Super Battle Golf. This was a chaotic multiplayer golf game that somehow became one of the highlights of my year. year. What stood out to me most wasn't just the gameplay, it was the community moments. Some of my favorite streams this year came from playing this game and just watching things go completely off the rails and laughing with all of you guys. It's so easy to pick up, surprisingly competitive, and just creates so many fun moments. The reason it's landing in the S tier is because when I look back at 2026 so far, this isn't just a game I played, it's a game that definitely created memories. Now, Cozy Caravan. This one was a cozy adventure game where you travel from your town to town in your caravan, helping people, gathering resources, and preparing for local markets. And honestly, this game is everything that I want from a cozy game. What stood out to me the most was the market loop, gathering the materials, crafting products, preparing for the next market, and slowly upgrading my caravan was incredibly satisfying. Every upgrade felt meaningful, every week felt productive, and I always had another goal waiting for me. Even though there was some backtracking, I never stopped enjoying the routine. Every time I sat down, I felt like I was making some progress towards something, and that's exactly what I look for in a cozy game. This is one of the easiest recommendations that I've made all year, and that's why it's landing in the S tier. Now, Collector's Cove. This was a collection-focused cozy adventure where you explore, discover treasures, complete collections, and slowly uncover everything the world has to offer. And if you know me, you already know I was obsessed with this game. What stood out to me most was how perfectly it tapped into my completionist brain. This game basically weaponized my completionist tendencies. There was always another collection to complete, another secret to uncover, or another goal to work towards. It's one of those games where you sit down planning to play for 20 minutes and suddenly you realize half of your day is gone. For me, it's the sign of a great cozy game, which is exactly why it's in my S tier. The Last Gas Station. This was another management sim where you're restoring and running an old gas station while serving customers, stocking shelves, and expanding your business. This game absolutely consumed my life. What stood out to me most was just how addictive the progression felt. Every upgrade unlocked something new, every goal led to another goal, and I just constantly felt like I was building towards something bigger. I literally sat down intending to play this for a little while and ended up spending hours running my little gas station. It's repetitive at times, sure, but it's kind of the repetition that becomes relaxing instead of frustrating. This game just perfectly captures that just one more day feeling that I love so much, and that's exactly why it's landing in the S tier. Now, Thrifty Business was another management game where you're buying, organizing, pricing, and selling items while slowly growing your thrift store. And honestly, this might be one of the most me games that I've played all year. What stood out to me most was the sense of progression. Every improvement mattered, every organizational decision mattered, every expansion actually felt earned. This is exactly the kind of game where I completely lose track of time because there's always something productive to do. I love games that give me goals, routines, and just meaningful progression, and Thrifty Business absolutely nails all three of those. That's why it's not just an S tier game, it's one of the defining games of my year so far. Now, Forza Horizon 6. Now, I know this one isn't exactly a traditional cozy game, but I couldn't make this list without including it. What really stood out to me most is just how relaxing it felt to just drive around, explore, and slowly work through everything the game has to offer. There were times where I would load in with no real objective, just pick a direction and just enjoy the ride. The world is beautiful and there's an incredible amount of content, and it's just one of those games I just kept coming back to. Maybe it's not cozy in the traditional sense, but it gave me that same feeling of comfort and relaxation that my favorite cozy games do. And because of that, it's easily earned its place in my S tier. And that's every game that I played so far in 2026 ranked for you. Honestly, putting this list together definitely made me realize that I have a type when it comes to cozy games. Give me progression, give me routine, give me meaningful goals, and give me something that keeps me saying just one more thing before I log off, and there's a pretty good chance that I'm gonna love it. Looking back at this list, it's honestly kind of funny how obvious that pattern is. Now, of course, this is just my personal ranking, and I'm sure some of you already have some games that you would move up or down or just completely swap around entirely. So let me know down below. What's been your favorite game of 2026 so far, and is there anything coming out later this year that you're excited for? If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe for more cozy gaming content. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, so happy gaming!